Thank you so much for joining us today. It's the second part of a great workshop with our dear member Kaleidoscope. Klaus Fleischmann will enlighten us again. Hi, welcome, dear Klaus. It was so great. The first part where you just introduced let's say, the key topics of professional terminology management, how to cope with the multitude of different glossaries and translation memories and term bases and whatnot from various sources in our organizations. And today is the second part. So please, dear Klaus, I will allow you to share your screen.
And yes, that would be good.
The floor is yours. Thanks a lot again for making time for doing that workshop with us. And please, dear participants, whenever you have a question, you can raise your hand, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question. You can write it in the chat. I have an eye on everything so that Klaus can move on with his presentation.
Yes, and this time I'm aware it's only 1 hour.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me for only 1 hour. That makes it easier. Right, so last time, as you said, I spent a lot of time on, let's say, my view of terminology and why I think it's important and how to talk to, I don't know, colleagues and bosses, etc., about terminology and get them excited. And I started a little bit also already into the process. So I started out by talking a little bit about the source language processes, where I see that in companies there are 3 different approaches to doing terminology work, the classic terminology work. There is very often batch processes, which means that you do something offline. Very often it's Excel lists, or you just get them from somewhere and you need to bring them into the term base and then validate them. We actually looked at this one last time already. I don't know if we want to look at it again just to refresh us. We can vote on that. Then there is also the systematic approach, where essentially a terminologist sits down and says, okay, I have this subject matter area. I want to systematically work on getting terminology out of that. I find that our customers really like our concept map feature to do that. So concept maps are really a network of concepts with relationships. It's kind of like an ontology, but doesn't have the goal to put each and every term into one big network, just the ones that make sense to link. And I find that a lot of customers use concept maps as a kind of flip chart, where they put little post-it notes and then they just talk about the entire flip chart with all the post-it notes as at once when they go into meetings with subject matter experts, etc. And then you also have the ad hoc process, which means that spontaneously out of the blue, I just realized that it's actually a blue box. That's quite clever. Not intentionally, of course. So out of the blue, somebody requests something from you as a terminologist. This could be a translator that stumbles across a new term, or it could be, I don't know, a software developer that wants to put something on the UI, or it's somebody working with some database and couldn't find something. And then hopefully they will request that from the terminology process. And I made little videos. It's always a bit easier to show everything in videos, then I know it works and I don't lose time if the server freezes or something like that. And we looked at this the last time. It's 5 minutes. I suggest we just look at it again, maybe, so we get the full picture. So what I did here is I took this document essentially on my favorite topic of thin slab casting plants. I really love those. And what I did is I ran a terminology extraction on it. So this is one way how I can get like offline terminology essentially. And then the question is, okay, how do I now bring it into a concept-oriented term base? And our approach to that is, you can do it several ways, but my favorite approach is you create an Excel template. You create a template that contains exactly the fields you would like to have filled out or you would like to import. So we have term, usage, note, and other stuff. And then we just create a blank template out of that. And then we can pre-fill that template. You could, of course, also take an Excel sheet that you get from somewhere and import it and map all the values to the right values and all the fields to the right fields, etc. But I find that this is very often very useful to agree on a template that you work with. So for example, what I can do here is I can just copy all the terms. On the very left column, we have the concept ID. So it's basically the entry number or the record ID. And since these are all new, I just put the star there or an asterisk, which then stands for created. It comes from, genealogy, where the asterisk always means somebody was born or something was created. So that's why we have the asterisk. And as you can see, the really nice thing about doing this in batch outside of the term base in something like Excel, apart from the fact that anyone can do it, even if they have no idea what the terminology database looks like, is the fact that you can apply content to a lot of entries at the same time. Of course, not the definition. Jumped to the wrong place here. The definition obviously only works for this one particular concept and not all of them. But these other things like project number, product, node, usage, assuming that all of these are allowed terms, you can just copy paste that into every column and then batch import them all at once. So I save this out and then we have another, we call them automation tasks. You could also call them templates if you want to. And then we can say, okay, import this right back. I think I realized I need to close the Excel file, otherwise I get an access violation, of course. Two applications cannot open the same file at the same time. But then it just goes in and it imports everything and it knows exactly what goes where, because we ourselves created that template and that template obviously links in directly into the term-based model and everything. So you see in the log, it looks nice. And then, of course, if we look at the term-based content itself, we can see that the casting plant, for example, is now here, continuous caster, all of that. So everything that we filled out in the Excel sheet is just directly imported. And then the next step is that we want to have this validated. And of course, our tool has an entire validation process behind it. We can see in the dashboard also that new stuff has been added now. This is also quite handy, so you can spot what is actually changing in the term base. But we can then do is we can run into workflows. So for example, we can have different approval workflows configured in the system, and then we just send this one English entry into this particular approval process, which is a 3-step approval process, so quite complicated one, which goes, I don't know, first to marketing, then to some other division. In the end, it goes to the super boss who can reject everything else or not. And basically, in our system, there really is a task list for everybody. So you don't have to filter the term base and say, show me everything that has a certain status or something like that. But you really have tasks with deadlines. And one important thing also is all the communication is centralized. So you can ask your colleague something, or if there's more than one terminologist, for example, in your organization, you can all chat with one another. And the advantage is, of course, this chat is linked to the entry and it is stored. So in a month, if you come back and say, oh, I can't remember what we discussed back then, you can just look it up in all the comments that are associated to that particular entry, and you will find what the whole discussion was about. That's a little bit how you do it. I can't quite remember what else comes. I think I just show that all the way in the end. It is then, it has the workflow status final. So of course we put the workflow status there. You can look at the entire history and see what has happened to it, who approved it, who rejected it. You can look at the chat, see what they all chatted about that, etc. So this, just as a repetition, this was the, oops, go back here. This was the batch process. And I also want to show you this systematic process, which really is, let's say, a terminologist who sits down and says, I want to look at this particular product, for example, or this particular subject matter, or this set of documents or something like that, and really pull out the terminology from that. And I have to jump to the next video. I'm using the same document. So what I'm pretending to do here is I'm pretending to go through it, and I'm going to create what we call a concept map. Again, you can compare this to a flip chart with lots of entries on it, but they are all related. So what I can do now is the first term that I found in there was the thin slab casting plant. So I search for that in the term base. It doesn't exist. And then I can immediately add it. And I add it not directly into the term base. So this does not automatically become a term yet. But I added what we call as a term request. So this is something that we think should be in the term base, and we can add all the information to it. But since it hasn't gone through the entire validation process, it's not actually yet really in the term base. So yeah, we can add all the metadata that we want, some usage information maybe, or the term type, or the source maybe. And then I basically, okay, I put the source here. And then I say, okay, I want to send this off as a term request, and I want to also keep it on my flip chart. So I have this little, looks like a sticky note kind of. So I have this on the flip chart. And then I keep reading through the document, and I see, okay, molten steel. So that looks like a term candidate. So let's figure out if that already exists in the term base. And yes, it does. But what I can do is I can include it on my flip chart. And now the beauty of the concept maps is that you can also put these concepts into relationship. So I can say, well, the thin slab casting plant produces molten steel. No idea if that is correct. I am actually not an expert in thin slab casting plants. And then there are some other terms like the billet or the continuous caster. So that apparently also exists. So I can also add that and say, I don't know, it's just a parent relationship maybe, or you can, of course, customize all these relationships. So whatever relationships you would like to have, you can put them in the system. So it's a bit different than in your private life, where you cannot so easily customize your relationships, but in the term base you can. So we can add the bloom, which also has something to do with this process. Kind of fast forward a little bit here, and then the billet, and we can put all these things together in the concept map. And the nice thing is then when we go into a validation process, for example, we have a terminology meeting about this subject matter with all our subject matter experts, you can look at the entire concept map at once. So you don't necessarily have to look at individual concepts, but you can actually look at the entire concept map and say, do you agree? Is something missing? Then you can add something. And that really makes the process very quick. And then all the term requests that we have put onto that flip chart, so to speak, we can now validate them. I have them in the list of my term requests. As I said, it's not yet in the term base, it's only requested. And for example, what I'm doing here is I'm going to assign a task to a particular user group because, as I said, I'm not the expert on thin slab casting plants or whatever I'm sending here. So I'm asking them to please provide a definition for that. And if I log in as that user, the important thing is this user does not normally actually have access to edit the content of the term base. But when they get a task, I can, inside that task, I can allow them to edit, for example, the definition or whatever fields I sent to them as part of this task. So they can see the entry on the right-hand side. It's not a lot there at the moment. And they can supply the definition. Depending on how that workflow is configured, this can also be a voting process, and you could have 10 people discuss this, and in the end they vote whether they agree on the definition or not. But at some point, it all comes back to the terminologist as a validated entry, so to speak, and I can look at it and see, okay, what did they come up with? And if I agree with that, I can import the changes, and then it becomes part of my entry, of course, if I create it in the term base. And then if I look that up now, this is the one that we just validated and included in the term base. I can see, of course, this term is there, but I can also see the entire concept map. So again, I will understand that the continuous caster produces billets. So we're actually doing a lot more in this approving concept maps or looking at concept maps than only quote unquote talking about the terms. We are actually really talking about the concept relationships. And if you want, it's a little bit like a knowledge graph. So we can actually explain visually what does the billet have to do with the continuous caster? Well, it's the product that comes out of this process because the continuous caster produces billets. So this is super nice, of course, for the user. It's a lot of additional knowledge and know-how that you can gain out of these maps. But at the same time, for the validation process, it really helps the subject matter experts discuss these things with the terminology team. Because normally, if you just give them one entry and you say, can you please validate billet? It's going to be hard because they don't know in what context do you mean that. Or if you say, can you validate the continuous caster? Then they might look at the definition and say, oh, but it's important to note it produces this and that, etc. So I think with this graphical visualization, not only do we make the validation process a lot easier, but of course, we also get additional know-how out of this.
Klaus, may I ask you a question, please?
Okay.
Would you recommend that one person is responsible for all these visualizations, or even of maintaining this tool, or do you recommend that several people should have access to the tool and mess around with it? Or what's the best solution from your experience?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely our goal is that everybody has access to it. But not necessarily mess around with it. That's why we have processes in the tool.
Okay.
So for example, if you look on the right-hand side, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse in the Zoom broadcast.
Yeah, we do.
So here I have a lot of commands. I can do a lot of stuff because I'm logged in as a terminologist. So I can create a new entry. I can assign tasks. If we want to give access to the entire company, I would remove all these features here. So the normal user would not be able to simply delete an entry. I mean, that would be disastrous, or create one. They cannot do that. But what they can do is they can launch workflows. So for example, they could request a new term.
Okay.
Or they could like an entry. Yeah, that's also important because, I mean, it sounds funny, but if the terminologist looks at what kind of entries do my users actually like, there's something you can learn from that.
Yeah, sure. That's cool.
You know what? Yeah.
And we're so used to like things,
yes.
right?
We go blunk, blunk.
I bet your kids helped you again with that.
That's more a feature for my wife actually than for my kids.
There is another question, a good one for you, from Joseph. How do you decide on the term usage in case of more synonyms in one domain?
Yeah, so I mean, this is exactly what the validation process is for. So we would then, I mean, either the terminologist decides it, makes a suggestion, and then just sends it out for approval. Approval in our system, which is this little button down here, approval in our system means you can only answer yes or no. So this doesn't actually require you to input any data. And this is the typical thing that you do all the way at the end. You basically ask all the various divisions in your organization, does this work for you? Because as I think I showed last time, the problem of terminology in a large organization is always that different divisions have different views of language and different views even of concepts. So what works for one division or one part of the organization does not necessarily work for the other one because they have a different background view of the world and of the things they do. So this is really the purpose of the approval task, to send something out and say, do you all agree? So this would be one way. You have somebody who, thinks about it and says, I think it should be synonym number C or number 3 actually. And then you just label it as that and you send out an approval task and ask everybody, do you agree? There's a different process. We can have an edit task. I just showed you actually in this video. You saw that I selected the definition as the thing they should please edit. I could, of course, also select the usage flag as the thing that they should edit. And then you can send that to, I don't know, 10 subject matter experts. They can discuss that among one another and in the end say, okay, we have agreed. This is what we think should be the main term. That's what we call an edit task. We have a third way of actually coming up with that, and that is what we call a discussion task. A discussion task basically means I have a concept here. Please discuss what we should call that, or which term we should define as the default or the allowed term. for this particular concept. So very often our clients actually use the discussion task when they have something new that they really don't know what they're gonna call it. And then they send it out to, I don't know, 50 users, and they can make suggestions, discuss it using our chat function, and they can vote. So in this discussion task, what we have is we basically have a voting process for individual terms. And then what you get back as a terminologist from the discussion task is you get back 32 people think that term A should be the allowed term, 15 people think term B should be allowed term, nobody thinks term C should be the allowed term. And then basically you have a voting system on that. That's also useful sometimes for the foreign languages, particularly if it's something that doesn't even exist yet in the foreign languages. You have that a lot with very innovative companies that, you know, actually produce a lot of new concepts because they invent stuff. And then very often there simply isn't a name for that in the target languages. And then some of them send this out to discussion tasks. For example, HP does that, Hewlett Packard. So if they have like a cool new feature and they have no idea what they're going to call it in, let's say, French, they send it out to their community using this tool. And then their translation community, they can suggest new terms. They can vote on the terms. And then they even take it one step further. They even have communities inside the tool. So they have things like the person who gave the most suggestions for a new terminology, or the person that got the most votes, or things like that. So you really have like terminology heroes in these communities for the people that make the most, you know, from a quantitative perspective, make the most suggestions, but also people that make the best suggestions. So these kind of things can also work.
Klaus, there is a real good question from Serge. Which software is this?
Didn't I mention that? It's our terminology management software called QuickTerm. It actually doesn't say anything yet.
Maybe you want to elaborate a little bit on that, because it used to be an add-on to Trados, right? To STL.
But yes, originally it was.
Yeah.
So originally we developed it as an add-on to the multi-term server, which really didn't have any of these features. But I think 3 or 4 years ago, that is no longer a condition. You can still implement it that way. So of course, if you already have multi-term server and you want to add this functionality, you can just use it as an add-on. But if you have no software at all yet for terminology management, you can just also use it independently. And one of the big feature sets of our tool is also integration. So we can integrate the data with pretty much any other tool. So even if you're translating, let's say, with 5 different tools, we can deliver the terminology to those tools. Or if you have authoring tools or ontology tools, or maybe even some, I don't know, offline dictionaries you want to create with PDF files or something like that, we can produce all those.
So this is actually the tool not only for the workflow and these technical stuff, import, export, glossaries, etc. But it's also what we always preach, the tool for the terminology circles, yeah, for this. For the process, how to define terms together, right?
Yeah, that's exactly
Klaus?
it. Yes.
Yes, Serge here. You said this is compatible with multi-trans?
Insofar as we can deliver the terminology to multi-trans.
Okay. Because as you know, we're using multi-term. What are we using?
Multi-term, multi-trans, both.
Multi-term, I think. I think we're using multi-term, sorry.
Yeah, so with multi-term, we have a very intense integration. It is a real-time integration. So whatever you do in this tool, it's immediately available in multi-term, and the other way around. With some other tools, we have a more, let's say, periodic integration, for example, with memsource, You can say, I don't know, once an hour, I want to update my mem source term base, but it's not real time. The main reason is that a lot of cut tools don't really have a very sophisticated terminology engine. For example, memsource does not have a lot of flexibility when it comes to the term-based model itself. So what you then typically do is that in QuickTerm, you have a more sophisticated data model with, let's say, 20 or 30 fields or something like that. But then when you pass it on to the localization process, you don't need 30 fields. You only need 5 or 6. And then basically we only pass those 5 or 6 fields onto, for example, mem source. And I'm not using mem source as a unique example here, but every cut tool has a different approach to how they manage terminology. Some are better, some are not as sophisticated. And honestly, sometimes in the localization use case, you don't really need a really sophisticated tool. But I think if you discuss concepts and you have a validation process and things like that, then you do need a sophisticated tool.
Sure. We have another good question. How does this tool deal with confidential terms that only certain teams can work on?
So of course we have access restrictions. So you could classify an entry, for example. Here you see that this is classified for product B, for example. So you could have a model that says, I don't know, accessibility or whatever you want to call the flag. And then we can say, okay, this user group only has access to, let's say, product A, or I don't know, what did you call it? A confidentiality level 1 or something like that. And then you could say, okay, a second concept is classified as confidentiality level 2, and we can control that via the user access. But of course, also in terms of the integration, when we pass on terminology to external tools, this is also interesting because then we can really physically filter out those terms. And that means they don't even really exist in the database. This is something we see a lot in interesting industries, for example, in the computer gaming industry. You won't believe it, but this is a huge topic because when they have new games, and one of the things people really want to know is what are the names of the characters and what are the names of the planets where this game is going to be happening and stuff like that. That is always super confidential. And then this terminology simply does not get exported to the terminology tool. It exports some placeholder that will then later on substitute the real name, for example. So we can limit it with access restrictions, but we can also limit it by physically excluding this terminology from these target systems.
Great, thank you.
Cool. Yeah, so this was the concept map approach, and as you said, Gabriele, this is something that customers really use also for the terminology circle. So they will then go in with a concept map, and instead of approving or talking about individual concepts, they will talk about the whole area. Let's say, I don't know, certain kinds of, I don't know, legal stuff or engines or whatever your subject matter is that you're dealing with, because you can nicely group these things together. And then the subject matter experts will always say, oh yes, but you forgot, besides blooms and billets, we also have who knows what. And then you can directly in the meeting, you can add that. You can say, okay, I'm going to add this here in the map. We still need to validate that, so it's not going to be published in the term base immediately, but at least you already stored it and you know it somehow belongs to this whole map of concepts. Does that make sense? Yeah, to maybe jump to yet another scenario, which is this ad hoc use case. I'm going to go back here. So ad hoc was this spontaneous request where somebody looks for something, can't find it. And then I think it's super important that at that minute, potentially this person is just creating a new concept, or potentially he's looking for a completely wrong term. It already exists, but with a completely different term. In both cases, I think it's very important to enable these people to really file a request immediately where they are. Otherwise, what happens is there's a working title that gets created and is really hard to get out of all the systems 3 months down the road. So if you can find out about this immediately as a terminology team, that somebody just created something new, and then either approve it or add information or reject it or inform the user that, hey, what you just requested actually already exists, but please use this word instead. And you add their suggestion as a forbidden synonym, for example. And the way this can look like in our system, in my video, I'm just going to do it in our UI. So I look for the thin slab casting plant. I reset the term base. I can't find it, but I can immediately click on request term. I can add some information if it's configured that way. Some people think it's too much information, but it's always a balance between how much do I want to teach people what all this stuff is that they're inputting. But of course, the more information I get as a terminologist, the better. So we have comments there, we have priorities, you can send along files. And then of course, this request, since it's a process system, this request now goes to the terminologist, quote unquote, the process owner, if you want, who is in charge of, for example, this particular subject matter. And of course, that terminologist can then open the request. They can add information to it, like a classification. They can add fields on the language level, of course. Some definition. I can steal this one again. Yes, I actually did that in the video. And you can, of course, also add synonyms. You can add other terms, etc. And then again, you could from here spin off into an edit task and say, I need somebody else to please contribute. Or you can just create it in the term base. You can send it into an approval process, all these things. And when you close the request, you basically inform the person who asked it, thank you very much. It's not approved yet, but it's already available. So depending on your particular workflow that you have there. And again, you could, for example, now send it into the approval process. This also gets batched sometimes. So it's not always this way that you send individual entries into the approval process. You could also set up the system that once a week it finds all the terminology that was added, and then it sends it off into approval. But still, if it's super important, you could basically do it immediately whenever you want to. And then the approver has that in their inbox, in their to-do list. They can see, okay, this information was provided. Do I agree or do I not agree? And here, for example, I do not agree. So I say, we always call this a thin slabber. We don't actually call it a thin slab casting plant. And then this goes back to the terminologist because it was rejected. It was not accepted. The terminologist can see that it was rejected. So if you look on the left side, you can see that the status is rejected and returned to the terminologist. I see the comments, of course, that the approvers or whoever gave that comment told me. So I can now implement it and I can say, okay, it's not called a thin slab casting plant. It's called the thin slabber, I think. Funny word. So I'm going to assign this the preferred form. I'm going to change the other one to deprecated. And then I can't remember if I just store it or what I do. Yeah, I just store it. So this is now the new version. And if I think this is all I need for now, so I can release it already, I can also, as a terminologist, just go in and release it manually. Or as an alternative, send it back out into approval process and say, okay, I changed it. Does this work for you now? So this is, again, the whole process behind it. But the starting point of the process was just an individual spontaneous request of somebody who needed this new term. It could have also been, of course, that I discovered, oh, thin slab casting plant, that actually already exists in the term base. So then I could have merged this with some other entry. For example, if the thin slabber already existed as a concept, I could have just merged the synonym as a forbidden term, maybe, or a deprecated term. And again, I could have just closed this new term request and notified my user, telling him, thank you for your request, but actually please use thin slabber instead. So that was a little bit this spontaneous request kind of process, but with the entire terminology process behind it, of course. Does that make sense? I'll take that as a yes. And I look at the target languages, because after all, so far we've only been speaking about the source language. And now we're gonna talk about the target language. And why do I differentiate between source and target language processes? I think the main difference from my perspective is in the source language or source languages, typically the question is this thing really a concept? If so, how do I define this concept? How do I categorize it? Where does it fit in my concept map universe? Whereas all these things typically in the target language process, they don't play that much of a role anymore. It could, of course, be that you have, lack of how do you say that, lack of equality in terms of the concepts or equivalency. So maybe that does not really exist one-to-one. These things can, of course, happen. And by the way, concept maps are also really nice to discover that, because you can see, okay, well, I have one superordinate term with 3 subordinate concepts, but really in, I don't know, French, I don't really have this superordinate concept. It doesn't exist. So this is really nice also to discover these white holes, if you want, in the concept structure. But it's not a problem. You then simply leave that empty. So that simply doesn't exist in French. But you can see that the 3 subordinate terms, they actually have something to do with one another. How can this work in the target language? Well, again, it can happen in a batch way by exporting something out of the system, editing it offline, adding the target languages or whatever, then importing it. And then, of course, we can have a review process, an approval process, etc. on that imported data. We can have, or some customers have, a mixture of ad hoc and project-based approaches. So what they can do, for example, they can say, I have a terminology project where we now developed, I don't know, 100 new concepts in the source language. I want to send them all out to be translated. And that can be done or researched in the target language, but we always just call it translated. That's a bit easier linguistically. So then basically you send out these tasks to my target language terminologists or translators. And again, there could be a process there that it goes to, I don't know, a translator first, then maybe a language lead or something like that in your organization, or a quality manager. Then it might go to the in-country reviewer who checks whether that makes sense for their country. So this process can again be modeled in the system, or it can also happen continuously. And I find this also very appealing. So it can happen during the translation. So let's assume you're happily translating in your tool. You can see in the term base, this term actually exists, but only in English, let's say. But I have researched it now in German anyhow, because I need to put it in the translation. So with just a few clicks, I could send it into the workflow, into the process tool. As a new suggestion, I think this is the German equivalent for this concept. And again, it will run into the workflow. So it will go into the target country, for example, or it goes to a lead linguist first. So there will be some approval process around it. And you don't have translators simply adding terms with no validation whatsoever. And again, a few videos, what this could look like. Yeah, there's a lot of short videos. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create an Excel template again. But this time I'm not going to create an empty Excel template. I'm actually going to create one that already contains these terms. So I have a filter that I defined to find exactly these 8 terms. And then I can set up, again, this filter creation or this template creation task. We do it with these tasks because oftentimes you need it more than once. And then you don't want to remember what are all the fields that I clicked last time. So we set it up as a template that you can run again and again, or you can use it as a basis for the next time. So what this created is an Excel file that kind of looks like the one you saw half an hour ago, where we added the English terms. In this case, we're going to add the foreign language terms, and I did a little fast forward here. So basically what you can see is, apart from the English, we now have German terms in there with usage information, with some notes. And as you can see, this is also concept oriented, or put another way, it allows synonyms. So for example, in the source language, we only had the continuous caster here. In German, however, there are two different terms. One is the Gussanlage, the other one is the Gießanlage. It's all a bit invented, I agree. But we can do that technically because we just insert a line here. The template knows, because it has no concept ID, it knows it still belongs to the previous one. So basically we can insert as many lines as we want to. As long as there is not a new concept ID, the system knows it still belongs to the previous one. So this makes this very flexible, and it allows us to get around the normal problem with Excel files, that how do you deal with synonyms and how do I annotate synonyms in an Excel file. So here I think we elegantly solved this problem by simply adding additional lines. And then what we can do, just like we did before, we can just import that Excel file directly, no conversions or anything. We just indicate the Excel file immediately somewhere here. And then we just say go, and it imports all the entries. You see it has a point here, manual conflict resolution. So it could be that you have conflicting information in the Excel file, and then it just pops up dialogues where you can fix that. Or you look at the log file, which I just did right now, and you can see very exactly what it did. Just go back a second to the log file. Yeah. So here we can very precisely see what it did, what information it added, where it might have had problems, etc. And then at the end of the day, we have this terminology in the foreign languages in the system. And from here, we could, of course, now go into the review process, into the approval process. But I'll show that process then in the next video. Let's see, yep. So the next video where we have more like an ad hoc process, similar to the ad hoc process I showed you for the source language. An ad hoc process could be here, somebody needs something translated. So it could be that you have just created a new English entry and you just want it translated right away into the other languages or researched in the other languages. It could also be that somebody in the organization searches for something, finds it in English only, but really they needed it in French. So what they can do then is they can request that this please be researched in French. And that's the process that I'm showing here, I think. Oh, I think that's the previous one. Let me see if it's this one. Yeah, so here I have an English concept. Remember the thin slabber. And this we now want to put into other languages. And again, we have workflows. So all the way on the top, you can see that there's a workflow selector. So we have simple and complicated workflows, depending on how many steps there are involved and how many people should be approving it, etc. And then we just send it into translation with a comment, something like please hurry, very typical for the translation process. And then in this particular process, it's not done offline in Excel, but it's actually quote unquote translated in the system itself. So as a translator, as somebody or target language terminologist, whatever you call them, I can work on that immediately with a comment like, oof, okay, something that's in a hurry again. I can open it up in the system, and then we actually get a, let's say, localization dialogue, if you want to, that allows you to localize this. And what we do, for example, is we can also check in the term base, do we maybe already have something? So we're supposed to figure out the thin slab casting plant, but for example, we already know what slab means. So that already exists in German. So I can just add it here. We also know what casting plant means. We also have that already in the term base. So we can add that. And then we pretty much translated the whole thing already. And we can make almost sure that it's translated correctly. Again, we are concept oriented in the target language, so I can add whatever field I want to add and have the access right, of course. So I could say this is the preferred form. We can enter a synonym or 5 synonyms if you want to, or not. So really in your target language, if you have the right to it, you can be completely concept oriented and add everything you need. Particularly for the translation of the definition, it's also nice that we can search what do we already have. So we don't use forbidden terminology when we translate definitions, if you even translate definitions, but I think that does happen as a use case, that you take a source language definition and you translate it into another language to make sure we understand exactly that with this particular concept. And then from here, for example, in this, what I'm showing you here is we now have a language lead who reviews what the translator did and either says, this is fine, I can load this into the term base, or they can reject it. So they could have also sent it back to the translator and say, please rework it. Now we're in the step of the in-country reviewer. So I'm now a reviewer who's supposed to read this and approve or reject it. And again, as I said, we can either approve it or reject it. I'm going to skip the next one for reason of time. And because it's actually really similar, because the next one I wanted to show you is the project-based approach. It's very similar. The only difference is that here we say we have a project, 120 entries. Please send them all into translation at the same time. Then the translator gets 120 tasks. And of course, then we can monitor in the task view, how far is he, how many entries do they still have to translate. So we have like a project management functionality there as well. But what I do want to show you is the continuous one, because I think this might be interesting. And in my video, I actually integrated this into Studio. So if you know Trados Studio as the cut tool or translation editor, we actually have a plugin into Studio. So you can display the terminology the way we like to display it, making it very clear what is allowed and what is not allowed, because that's actually a bit of a problem in the default implementation of terminology in Studio. You can't really see if a term is allowed or not, but we have to do a lot with prescriptive terminology. So we think that's obviously very important to be able to see if something is allowed or not. So here we're translating a text. As you can see, we automatically detect all the terms that appear in this particular segment. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start translating a little bit. I can also see, by the way, that forgot what the video is about. So what I can see here actually is that thin slab casting plant exists in the terminology, in the term base, but only in English. I'm translating into German. It does not exist in the term base yet. But what I can do is I have these options here on the right-hand side. So I could request this as a completely new entry. If I find something else in here, which is not in the term base at all, I can request a completely new entry. Or what I can do is I can say, well, I'm translating it anyhow, so I can just suggest a new translation for this entry. And that suggestion then also goes into the process, since we're talking about processes here. I could also do things like request a change or send feedback or something like that. But in the video, I'm actually going to do a translation and then suggest my translation. So I'm just going to go in here and say eine Dünnbrammen-Strandgussanlage is whatever. I'm a slow translator. And then I can say, I want to suggest this as a translation for thin slab casting plant. And I press a button, which takes me immediately into our software. It copied all the stuff that I had selected. So it knows which user am I, because it knows that from the plugin we're logged into the system, so it knows who I am. It copied the term that I had highlighted. We can set it up so it copies the file name as a source, or the actual translation as a context sentence. Well, actually, this was the project name, I think. Yeah, this is the project name. This is the file name. So we can transmit a lot of information from the cut tool directly into that suggestion already. But essentially, as a translator, I can now add all the other information I want. So I could add synonyms if I want to. Again, as you saw before, I could add additional fields. So all of this flexibility that we had before, we of course also have here. And then I can send it on to, let's say, a lead translator or a quality manager or main translator, as I call it here. And when the main translator then logs in, they can see what has been suggested by the translators. So for example, here I can see, okay, there's a suggestion here for the thin slab casting plant. The translator thinks it should be Dünnbrammenstein Gussanlage, but I don't agree as a quality manager or whatever. And I'm gonna send it back to them, say, please rework it. It should not be Guss, it should be Gies, as we all know. And then in the process, it goes back to the translator, who can obviously got an email in the background as well, saying that somebody disagreed with your suggestion, and they can now rework it. So they can go in here and say, what was the problem? Okay, it should be Gies and not Guss. They could, of course, start discussing with the main translator now, or they just believe them and say, okay, then I'm actually gonna label this one as deprecated. So I wouldn't delete it from the term base, because if it was rejected, it's good to keep that information that that is not the correct term. But I would say, okay, I add the preferred form, and then from here I send it on to the main translator again, and the main translator then hopefully agrees. Okay, you're right, I'm changing it. Okay, and then I can say, okay, bring this into the term base, and only now is it actually in the term base. So the suggestion in that phase, it was actually not in the term base yet. Only when the lead translator or whoever it is agrees, then it gets imported into the term base. And yeah, that's all I had prepared, Gabriele, for showing you a little bit around the processes, how you can manage, you know, a very, let's say, decentralized terminology workflow within a tool which is called QuickTerm, to answer that question.
Yeah. Excellent, Klaus. Thanks a lot. Guys, we have 3 more minutes for questions or comments or whatever you would like to raise. You can blame Klaus or me. You can you can praise. Whatever you like. For me, it's thanks a lot, Klaus. For me, it really looks very good. It actually, yeah, again, it reflects what we are recommending people in our trainings and in our consultancy. So that's really good to see that now we can also purchase it as an independent tool, let's say. It does it? Yes, Serge, go ahead.
The consultation portion of this, where you send it to people for them to comment and propose new things, possibly, is it possible to have that web-based?
Yes, everything is web-based or browser-based, I like to say. Yeah.
Okay.
So this what you see here on the screen, that's actually Google Chrome, and the software is running inside it.
Okay. And do they need to have special access to it, or is it open to everyone?
Well, it depends on how you deploy it. So if you install this in your corporate network and you close all the ports to the outside world, then no, then you can only access it internally. If you we have a cloud, so you can obtain this as a cloud subscription, and then by definition it's open to everybody. Then you just need a login, a username, and a password.
Okay, that was my question.
As a matter of fact, you don't even really need that. So we do have a way of simply saying, if you know the URL, you're in the term base, period. Okay. Not a lot of organizations allow that. As a matter of fact, there are some that allow that. Also corporate customers, because they say we actually want to influence the industry with our terminology. So they do allow that, but it's the minority. Most of our customers say no, you have to have at least a username and a password to log in. But technologically, it's possible. We have an auto login feature where we can say, okay, if you know the URL, I mean, this is my local demo server here, but if you type in that URL, you're immediately in the term base and you get to the dashboard. Normally that would then be the dashboard where you can see, welcome to the term base, this is what you can do, or something like that.
Okay, vielen Dank.
Gerne.
Vielen Dank. May I say something? For me, the QuickTerm looks very user-friendly, and that's the magic behind every tool, it should be user-friendly. It should look simple, but it seems to have many functionalities behind it. So I would like to try it out as well.
Is there a demo version, Klaus, or a little discount for terminology group coaching members? That's a good question. Thank you, Joseph, for that.
Yes, there is actually a public demo version. We are in the process of upgrading our demo server. It's not quite on the most recent version. But if you go to, let me put it here, demo.kaleidoscope.at, you actually get to our publicly available demo server. And then you find a little icon there that says quick term or something like that. Let me check it out. You also find some documents there, a testing guide, because you need to know the usernames and the passwords that are set up and all of that. But with that, if you click on the icon quick term, you are basically in our software. Feel free to do whatever you want to in that system, because it gets reset every night. So the demo server gets restored to the source status every night, simply because otherwise it would be completely messed up after a week.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. If you want a more customized test environment, we also have that. So apart from what we call the demo server, we also have what we call a trial server.
Yeah.
The trial server it's also in our cloud, like the demo server. And what it allows you to do, we will create the tenant for you on there, and it's your tenant. And then you can reconfigure it, add your own terms, change the term-based model, do everything you want. We don't reset it. We do recommend, if you want to go for a trial, that you book a few hours of training or consulting or just help. But of course, we have people that love to experiment, and then we say, sure, we'll create a tenant, it's free, play with it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Klaus. Please stay in the line. We have a couple of things to discuss afterwards.
Yep.
I will stop recording.